The bullet whistled past Zara Bennett's ear close enough that she felt the heat of it, and she didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't do anything except continue loading her father's revolver with steady hands that had long forgotten how to tremble. The year was 1881, and Cripple Creek, Colorado had just become another town where she'd have to prove that being a woman didn't make her an easy target, and she was tired, so bone deep tired of proving anything to anyone anymore. The man who'd fired the warning shot was standing 20 feet away in the dusty street, his face red with whiskey and rage, shouting something about her father's debts and how a woman had no business running a general store. Zara barely heard him. She'd heard it all before in 3 different territories, and the words had stopped meaning anything somewhere between Missouri and the Kansas border. Her father had been dead for 2 months now, buried in a grave outside Dodge City, and she'd kept moving west because moving was easier than staying still, easier than feeling, easier than remembering that she'd once been a different person who believed in different things. "You listening to me, woman?" the man bellowed, and Zara finally looked up at him with eyes the color of winter steel, flat and cold and empty of anything resembling fear or compassion or even basic human warmth. "I heard you," she said, her voice as level as a table top. "You're saying my father owed you money for a card game 3 years ago in Denver. I'm saying I never met my father 3 years ago, and even if your story wasn't obviously a lie, his debts died with him. Now get off my property before I shoot you somewhere that'll make you think twice about intimidating women in the street." She raised the revolver as she spoke, and her hands didn't shake, not even a little. The man's eyes widened and he took a step back. Good. Let him be afraid. Fear was honest, at least. Fear didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. "You can't talk to me like that," he stammered, but he was already backing away, and Zara could see the exact moment when he decided she was crazy enough to actually pull the trigger. "This ain't over." "Yes, it is," Zara said, and waited until he'd turned tail and half run, half stumbled down the street before she lowered the gun and went back inside her store. The interior was dim and cool after the bright heat of the Colorado afternoon, and Zara set the revolver on the counter with a soft click that seemed too loud in the empty space. The store smelled like wood and leather, and the faint mustiness of the grain sacks stacked against the far wall. She'd bought it with the last of the money from selling her father's wagon and team, and it was hers, all hers, the first thing she'd ever owned outright. It should have felt like an accomplishment. Instead, it felt like a cell she'd locked herself into, but cells were safe. Cells meant no one could get close enough to hurt you, and Zara had learned that lesson too well to ever forget it. She was restocking the shelf of canned goods when the door opened behind her, and she turned with her hand, already moving toward the revolver she'd tucked into her belt. But the man who walked in wasn't the drunk from the street. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders under a worn blue shirt and dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His face was tanned and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, but his eyes were a warm brown that seemed at odds with the hard line of his jaw. And when he saw her hand on the gun, he stopped immediately and held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "Madam," he said, and his voice was a low rumble that somehow managed to sound gentle despite its depth. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need some supplies." Zara studied him for a long moment, cataloging the details with the automatic assessment she'd developed over years of dealing with dangerous men. No gun on his hip, though there was a knife sheathed at his belt. Dust on his boots and the legs of his trousers, like he'd been riding. Calloused hands that spoke of hard work rather than gambling or thieving. He looked honest, but then, the best liars always did. "What kind of supplies?" she asked, not moving her hand from the gun. If he was offended by her caution, he didn't show it. "Coffee, beans, flour, some salt pork if you have it. I'm working at the Iverson Ranch about 5 miles south of here, and the foreman sent me into town for provisions." Zara nodded slowly and let her hand fall away from the weapon. "I have all that. Anything else?" "Maybe some tobacco, if the price is fair." She turned back to the shelves and started gathering the items he'd listed, very aware of him standing there watching her. It made her skin prickle with discomfort, not because she thought he meant her harm, but because she couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her without suspicion or anger, or the calculating interest of men who thought a woman alone was fair game. He was just looking at her like she was a person, and somehow that was worse than all the other looks combined. "I saw what happened out there," he said after a moment, his tone conversational but not intrusive. "With Garrett, he's all talk mostly. Gets drunk and picks fights he can't finish, then sobers up and apologizes the next day. But you handled it well. Not many folks can stare down a man with a gun and make him back down." "I've had practice," Zara said shortly, setting a bag of coffee beans on the counter harder than necessary. "I'm sure you have." There was something in his voice that made her look up sharply, but his expression was neutral, even kind. "I'm Boone Irwin, by the way. I've been in Cripple Creek about 2 weeks now. Figured I should introduce myself since I'll probably be coming by pretty regular for supplies." "Zara Bennett," she said, because not giving her name would have been strange, and strange attracted attention she didn't want. "That'll be $4.20. Boone pulled out a worn leather wallet and counted out the money carefully, then added an extra dime. "For your trouble with Garrett," he said when she raised an eyebrow at the overpayment. "And because I appreciate a shopkeeper who doesn't try to gouge folks just because they're new in town." "I don't want your charity," Zara said, holding out the dime. "It's not charity. It's good business sense." He smiled at her, a slow, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and transformed his whole face into something warm and open and completely disarming. "Happy customers come back. Angry customers go to the competition, and from what I hear, the nearest other general store is in Victor, which is a fair ride from here." Zara wanted to argue, but he had a point, and she was practical above all else. She closed her fingers around the dime and gave him a curt nod. "Fine." "Thank you." "You're welcome, Miss Bennett." He gathered up his supplies with easy competence, settling them into the canvas bag he'd brought with him. "I'll probably see you again next week. You take care of yourself." He was gone before she could formulate a response, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft jingle of the bell she'd hung there to announce customers. Zara stood alone in the dim store and told herself the strange hollowness in her chest was just hunger, nothing more. Over the next 3 weeks, Boone Irwin came to her store 6 times, always polite, always friendly, always careful to keep a respectful distance that never felt threatening or presumptuous. He made small talk about the weather and the work at the ranch and the best places to fish in the creek that gave the town its name, and Zara responded with monosyllables and silence because she didn't know how to do anything else anymore. But he never seemed offended by her coldness. He just smiled that warm, genuine smile and went on his way, always leaving an extra dime on the counter despite her protests. The 4th time he came in, he arrived just as another customer was leaving, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson who ran the boarding house on 3rd Street. She gave Boone a speculative look, then turned to Zara with eyebrows raised in obvious interest. "That's a fine young man," Mrs. Henderson said, loud enough that Boone could definitely hear her from where he was examining a display of rope near the door. "Single too, from what I hear." You could do worse, Miss Bennett. I'm not interested, Zara said flatly, wrapping Mrs. Henderson's purchase of thread and needles with brisk efficiency. That'll be 30 cents, Mrs. Henderson's expression softened into something that might have been pity, and Zara hated it, hated the sympathy and the concern and the unspoken questions about why a woman her age, maybe 24 or 25, was running a store alone instead of married with children. Of course, dear. I didn't mean to pry. It's just that a woman needs someone to look after her in a town like this. I look after myself, Zara said, handing over the package with a finality that brooked no further discussion. When Mrs. Henderson had finally left, Boone approached the counter with his usual list of supplies and an expression of mild embarrassment. I apologize for that, he said quietly. Small towns, people talk. I hope she didn't make you uncomfortable. I'm not uncomfortable, Zara lied, already pulling flour and coffee from the shelves. People can think what they want. It doesn't change anything. No, I suppose it doesn't. He was quiet while she assembled his order, but when she started to calculate the total, he cleared his throat. Miss Bennett, I was wondering if you might be able to help me with something. I'm looking to buy a horse, and I heard there's a man south of here who breeds good stock. But I'm not from Colorado originally, and I don't know the territory well enough to know if I'm being pointed toward an honest dealer or someone who'll sell me a lame nag and disappear before I realize it. Would you happen to know anything about horse breeders around here? It was such a reasonable question, asked in such a straightforward way, that Zara found herself answering before she'd consciously decided to. Martin Cresswell, she said. He has a place about 8 miles southeast of town. He's honest and his horses are sound. Tell him Zara Bennett sent you and he'll give you a fair price. Thank you, Boone said, and the gratitude in his voice seemed disproportionate to the small favor. I appreciate it. Would you, maybe, consider coming with me? I'd value your opinion on picking out a good horse, and I'd pay you for your time, of course. No, Zara said immediately, almost reflexively. The thought of spending hours alone with this man, riding through open country where there'd be no witnesses and no help if he turned out to be like all the other men who'd smiled at her and said kind words before showing their true nature, made her stomach clench with anxiety. I can't leave the store. Of course, Boone said easily, not pushing, not arguing. It was presumptuous of me to ask. I'll manage on my own. Thank you for the recommendation. He paid for his supplies and left, and Zara told herself she felt relieved. But that night, lying in the narrow bed in the room behind the store, she kept thinking about the way he'd accepted her refusal without guilt tripping or sulking, or any of the manipulative behaviors she'd come to expect. He just accepted it and moved on, as if her no was all the answer he needed. And that was so foreign to her experience that she didn't quite know what to make of it. The next morning, a Saturday in late September, dawned cool and clear with the promise of autumn in the air. Zara opened the store early as usual, swept the floor, and was restocking the display of lanterns near the window when Boone walked in carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "Morning, Miss Bennett," he said with his usual courtesy. "I'm not here for supplies today. I actually wanted to give you something." Zara stiffened immediately, her defenses snapping into place. Men didn't give women gifts without expecting something in return. That was a lesson written in scar tissue across her heart. "I don't want anything from you." "It's not like that," Boone said, and there was something in his voice, a note of understanding that made her look at him more closely. He held out the package with a careful gesture that kept distance between them. "Yesterday after I left here, I went out to Cresswell's place like you suggested. He did give me a fair deal, and I found a good horse because of your advice. This is just a thank you. If you don't want it, I'll leave it on the counter and you can do whatever you like with it. But I wanted you to know that your help mattered." He set the package down gently and stepped back, hands at his sides, clearly giving her space to decide. Zara stared at it like it might bite her. "What is it?" "Shortbread cookies from the bakery on Main Street. Mrs. Chen, who runs the place, mentioned you never buy anything sweet for yourself, always just practical staples, and I thought maybe you'd like them. They're good cookies. No strings attached, Miss Bennett, just cookies." He left before she could argue, and Zara stood there for a long time looking at the brown paper package like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Finally, more out of curiosity than anything else, she unwrapped it. Inside were a dozen golden shortbread cookies, still slightly warm, the scent of butter and vanilla rising up to make her mouth water unexpectedly. She couldn't remember the last time someone had given her something sweet, something frivolous, something that served no purpose except pleasure. She ate one standing there at the counter, and it was delicious, and she hated that it made her throat tight and her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. She hated that a simple kindness could crack the ice around her heart even a fraction, because cracks were dangerous. Cracks let feeling in, and feeling led to pain, and she'd sworn to herself after her father died that she'd never let anyone close enough to hurt her again. But the cookies were good, and she ate another one despite herself. And when Boone came back 2 days later for supplies, she didn't tell him to stop leaving extra dimes on the counter. October arrived with the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides and frost decorating the windows each morning. The store did steady business as miners and ranchers stocked up for the winter ahead, and Zara worked from dawn until well past dark, exhausting herself with labor so she wouldn't have time to think or feel or remember. Boone continued his weekly visits, never intrusive but somehow always present, a constant in her carefully controlled world. The first snow came on a Tuesday night in mid-October, a wet, heavy snow that turned the streets into rivers of mud and made travel nearly impossible. Zara woke on Wednesday to find 3 inches of white covering everything, and the stove in the store had gone out sometime during the night, leaving the interior frigid. She was trying to restart the fire with numb fingers when the door opened and Boone walked in, stamping snow from his boots. "Morning," he said, then took one look at her struggling with the kindling and came over immediately. "Here, let me help with that. Your hands are shaking." "I can do it myself," Zara said, but her fingers weren't cooperating and the match she was holding went out before she could get it near the kindling. "I know you can," Boone said gently, "but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely. Please, Miss Bennett, let me." There was something in his voice, a kindness so genuine and uncomplicated that Zara found herself stepping back and letting him take over. He had the fire going in less than 5 minutes, coaxing the flames with a competence that spoke of long practice. When heat started radiating from the stove, Zara felt something in her chest unclench slightly. "Thank you," she said, the words coming out stiff and awkward. "You're welcome." Boone stood and brushed off his hands, then looked at her with concern that seemed entirely sincere. "Have you eaten breakfast? You look half frozen." "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Miss Bennett, I know you value your independence and I respect that, but it's no weakness to admit you need help sometimes. We all do. I'm certainly not some paragon who does everything alone. Why, just last week I got my fool self stuck in a ravine on the ranch and had to holler for help from 3 different ranch hands before someone heard me and brought a rope. Nearly died of embarrassment, but better embarrassed than stuck in a ravine overnight." The story was clearly intended to make her feel better about accepting help, and it was so transparent that Zara almost smiled despite herself. Almost. I have some eggs, she heard herself say. And bread. I was going to make breakfast after I got the fire started. That sounds good, Boone said. Would you mind if I joined you? I'll pay for the food, of course, and I promise not to overstay my welcome. But it's awful cold out there, and the ride back to the ranch is a long one. I could use some warming up before I brave it again. Zara knew she should say no. Letting him into her space, into the small room behind the store where she lived, was letting him cross a boundary she'd maintained since arriving in Cripple Creek. But the store was finally warming up and he had started the fire, and she was so tired of always being alone, even if admitting that felt like failure. "All right," she said. "But just breakfast, then you need to go." "Just breakfast," Boone agreed. She led him into the back room, which was sparse and clean and held nothing personal except a framed daguerreotype of her mother on the small table beside the bed. Boone looked around with interest but didn't comment on the bareness, just settled into one of the two chairs while she started cooking eggs on the small stove. They ate in silence at first, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Boone seemed content to just sit and eat, not filling the air with meaningless chatter or prying questions. It was Zara who finally broke the quiet, surprising herself. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked abruptly. "What do you want?" Boone set down his fork and looked at her steadily. "I don't want anything, Miss Bennett. I'm kind to you because you seem like someone who's been unkind to far too often, and I think you deserve better than that." "You don't know anything about me." "No," he agreed. "I don't, but I know what I see. I see a woman who's alone in a hard town, working herself to the bone, keeping everyone at arm's length because someone, somewhere, taught her that people can't be trusted. And I see someone who's lonely even though she'd probably rather die than admit it." Zara's hands clenched into fists on the table. "You're overstepping." "I know. I'm sorry." Boone's expression was apologetic but not insincere. "I have a bad habit of saying what I think even when I should keep my mouth shut. My mama used to say I was born without a proper filter between my brain and my tongue. I don't mean any disrespect, Miss Bennett. I just want you to know that if you ever did want to talk, or if you ever needed help with anything, I'd listen without judgment and I'd help without expecting anything in return. That's all." "Why?" The word came out harsh, almost desperate. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Because everybody needs somebody," Boone said simply. "And because I've been where you are, more or less. After my wife died 3 years ago, I spent a long time pushing everyone away, convinced I was better off alone. It took me a while to realize that being alone wasn't making me stronger, it was just making me hollower. I don't want that for you." Zara had stood up without realizing it, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Your wife." "Sarah," Boone said, and there was old grief in his voice but not fresh pain. "She died in childbirth, her and the baby both. It was in Kansas, on the farm where I grew up. I couldn't stay there after that, couldn't stand being surrounded by everything we'd planned together. So I left, came west, worked a dozen different ranches in 4 different territories. Spent a lot of time angry at the world and everyone in it. But eventually I learned that anger was just fear wearing a different coat, and I was tired of being afraid." "Afraid of what?" Zara whispered. "Afraid of caring about someone again and losing them. Afraid of being happy because happiness could be taken away. Afraid of living instead of just existing." He stood too, but kept the table between them, respecting her space even in the small room. "Miss Bennett, I'm not telling you this to make you uncomfortable or to suggest that we're the same. Everyone's pain is their own. I'm just telling you so you know that I understand a little bit about walls and why people build them. And I'm telling you that those walls didn't make me safer. They just made my world smaller and colder until I almost couldn't remember what warmth felt like. Zara's throat was tight, her chest aching with emotions she'd kept locked down for so long that feeling them now was almost physically painful. "I should clean up," she managed to say. "You should go." "Of course." Boone moved toward the door with careful courtesy, but paused before leaving. "Thank you for the breakfast, Miss Bennett, and thank you for your company, even briefly. It meant more to me than you probably realize." He was gone before she could respond, and Zara sank back into her chair with shaking hands and let herself cry for the first time since her father's death, silent tears that she wiped away furiously. But that kept coming anyway. She cried for her mother who died when Zara was 12, cried for her father who tried his best, but had been a wanderer unable to stay in one place. Cried for the girl she'd been at 18 who trusted the wrong man and learned in the cruelest way possible that trust could be weaponized. She cried for all the years of moving from town to town, never settling, never connecting, building her walls higher and thicker until she couldn't see out anymore and no one could see in. And when the tears finally stopped, she felt scraped raw and fragile but also somehow lighter, as if crying had let out some of the poison she'd been carrying for so long. Over the next few weeks, things shifted in ways so subtle that Zara almost didn't notice at first. Boone continued his visits to the store, but now, instead of just buying supplies and leaving, he'd sometimes linger to help with heavier tasks. He fixed a sagging shelf without being asked, repaired the door hinge that had been sticking, even rethatched a section of the roof where leaks had started during a heavy rain. Zara protested each time, insisting she could handle things herself, but Boone would just smile and say something like, "I know you can, but I'm here and I have time, so why not?" And somehow she'd find herself accepting his help, standing aside while he worked, occasionally handing him tools or holding boards steady. He talked while he worked, a steady stream of stories about life on the ranch, about the horses and cattle, about the other ranch hands and their various antics. He talked about his childhood in Kansas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about his mother who'd been a school teacher and his father who'd been a Methodist circuit preacher, both dead now from fever that swept through their county 5 years back. He talked about books he'd read and places he'd been, and dreams he had about maybe owning his own small ranch someday. Nothing grand, but something that was his. Zara listened more than she spoke, but gradually she found herself responding, offering small comments that turned into longer sentences that eventually became actual conversation. She told him about her mother's family in Ohio, about how her father had never been able to settle after her mother died, always chasing the next opportunity over the next horizon. She told him about the years of moving, about learning to rely only on herself because everyone else eventually left or disappointed. She didn't tell him about Matthew, the man in Missouri who'd courted her with pretty words and promises, then tried to force himself on her when she wouldn't agree to marry him after knowing him only 2 weeks. She didn't tell him about the bruises or the fear or the way she'd had to leave that town in the middle of the night because Matthew had friends and she had no one. Some things were still too raw to speak aloud. But she told him enough that Boone began to understand the shape of her walls, even if he didn't know all the details of how they'd been built. And he never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never pried or prodded or demanded explanations. He just listened when she talked and respected her silence when she didn't. And somehow that patience, that consistent, reliable kindness, was more disarming than any aggressive pursuit could have been. November brought colder weather and shorter days, and one Friday afternoon when Boone came in for his weekly supplies, He found Zara struggling to move a shipment of crates that had been delivered that morning. The freight driver had dumped them just inside the door despite her protests, and they were blocking access to half the store. "Here," Boone said immediately, setting down his own parcels and moving to help. "Where do you want these?" "Back corner," Zara said, gesturing. "But you don't have to, I know," Boone interrupted gently. "But it'll go faster with 2 people, and I'd like to help if you'll let me." They worked together in companionable silence, moving the heavy crates one by one. Boone was strong, lifting boxes that Zara knew she'd have struggled with, but he never made her feel weak or incapable. When they finished, both of them were slightly out of breath, and Boone's shirt was damp with sweat despite the cold. "Thank you," Zara said, meaning it. "That would have taken me hours alone." "Happy to help." Boone wiped his forehead with his sleeve and gave her a warm smile. "Miss Bennett, I was wondering if I could ask you something, and please feel free to say no without any hard feelings." Zara tensed automatically. "What is it?" "There's a church social next Saturday evening. Just a barn dance with some food and music, nothing fancy. I was thinking about going, and I wondered if you'd like to come with me." "As friends," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "No pressure, no expectations. Just 2 people attending a dance together, so neither of us has to show up alone. What do you think?" Every instinct Zara had screamed at her to refuse. Going to a social event with Boone would make people talk, would make them assume things, would put her in a position of vulnerability she'd spent years avoiding. But another part of her, a part she'd thought was dead, wanted desperately to say yes. Wanted to go somewhere with music and laughter. Wanted to spend an evening doing something other than working or hiding in her small room. Wanted to spend more time with this man who'd been so inexplicably kind to her, without asking for anything in return. "I don't dance," she heard herself say, which wasn't a no even though it wasn't quite a yes either. "That's all right," Boone said easily. "Neither do I, really. I have 2 left feet and no sense of rhythm, but the food is usually good and it's nice to be around people sometimes. We could just go, eat some pie, listen to the music, and leave whenever you want. I'll have you back home by 10 o'clock if that'd make you feel better." "Why do you want me to come?" Zara asked, needing to understand his motivation. Boone considered the question seriously before answering. "Honestly, because I enjoy your company. I know that probably sounds strange given that you barely talk to me half the time, but I like being around you, Miss Bennett. You're genuine in a way most people aren't. You don't pretend to feel things you don't feel or say things just because they're polite. And I think maybe you could use an evening away from this store, away from work and worry, just doing something simple and pleasant. But if I'm wrong, if you'd rather not, then that's fine too. The offer stands either way, no obligation." Zara looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. But all she saw was earnest hope and that steady kindness that had become familiar over the past months. And she realized with a start that felt like waking up from a long sleep that she trusted him. Not completely, not with everything, but enough to take a small risk. "All right," she said, the word coming out quiet but clear. "I'll go with you, but I'm holding you to that 10 o'clock promise." The smile that spread across Boone's face was like sunrise, bright and warm and so genuinely happy that Zara felt an answering warmth kindle somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she'd thought had frozen solid years ago. "You've got my word, Miss Bennett. I'll pick you up at 6 o'clock next Saturday if that suits you." "That suits me fine." "Then it's a date. I mean not a date, just an appointment, a social appointment, between friends." Boone was actually blushing now, stumbling over his words in a way that was endearingly awkward. "I'm going to stop talking now before I make this worse." "That's probably wise," Zara said, and she almost smiled, the corners of her mouth twitching with an expression that felt foreign after so long. Boone left shortly after, but the store felt different somehow in his absence, less like a fortress and more like just a room. Zara went about her work for the rest of the day with something fluttering in her stomach that might have been anticipation, or might have been terror, or might have been some mixture of both. The week leading up to the social passed in a strange state of suspended anxiety. Zara found herself thinking about what to wear, then getting angry at herself for caring, then thinking about it anyway. She owned exactly 2 dresses that weren't for working in, and neither was anything special, just simple cotton garments in practical colors. But on Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Chen from the bakery came in and mentioned that the dry goods store in Victor had gotten in some new fabric, beautiful deep blue wool that would be perfect for winter. "You should get some," Mrs. Chen said. "Make yourself a new dress. A young woman should have at least one nice thing to wear to socials." "I don't need a new dress," Zara said automatically. "Need and want are different things," Mrs. Chen replied with the kind of gentle wisdom that came from having lived 60-plus years and raised 7 children. "You work too hard to never have nice things, Miss Bennett. Life is short. Sometimes it's okay to want things just because they make you happy." After Mrs. Chen left, Zara stood behind her counter and thought about happiness, about wanting things, about the blue wool that was apparently sitting in a store 8 miles away. It was foolish to even consider. She had perfectly functional clothing. She didn't need anything new. But the thought kept nagging at her through the rest of the day and into the evening, until finally, on Friday morning, she closed the store early, hitched up the small cart she kept in the lean-to out back, and made the ride to Victor. The fabric was as beautiful as advertised, a rich midnight blue that reminded her of the sky just after sunset. The shopkeeper offered her a fair price, and Zara bought it along with thread and new buttons, then rode back to Cripple Creek, feeling simultaneously foolish and excited. She stayed up late that night cutting and sewing by lamplight, her fingers remembering skills her mother had taught her years ago. The dress wouldn't be fancy, but it would fit properly and the color was lovely, and by the time she finished the last seam on Saturday afternoon, she had to admit that Mrs. Chen had been right. Having something nice, something just for herself, did make her happy in a small, precious way. Boone arrived at 6 o'clock exactly, dressed in a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. When Zara opened the door wearing the blue dress with her blonde hair pinned up instead of hanging loose as she usually wore it, his expression went soft with admiration. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "you look beautiful." Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks and didn't know what to say. No one had called her beautiful in years, and she'd forgotten how the word could make her feel simultaneously pleased and uncomfortable. "Thank you," she managed. "You look nice too." "I clean up adequately when required," Boone said with a self-deprecating grin. He offered his arm in a gesture that was courteous but not presumptuous. "Shall we?" The church where the social was being held was a half-mile walk through town, and the evening was cold but clear, stars already visible in the darkening sky. They walked in comfortable silence at first, but gradually began to talk, small observations about the weather and the buildings they passed, and the people heading in the same direction. By the time they arrived at the church, Zara felt less nervous and more curious about the evening ahead. The interior of the church had been transformed for the social, the pews pushed back against the walls to create space for dancing, tables set up along one side laden with food, a small group of musicians tuning their instruments in the corner. The room was warm and bright with lamplight, filled with people talking and laughing, and Zara felt a moment of panic at the crowd, the noise, the overwhelming sociability of it all. "You okay?" Boone asked quietly, noticing her hesitation. "Fine," Zara said, but her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "We can leave any time," Boone reminded her. "No shame in deciding it's too much, but let's at least get some of that pie I was promised. Mrs. Henderson makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, and I have it on good authority she brought 2 whole pies tonight." The mention of pie was absurd enough to make Zara relax slightly, and she let Boone guide her to the food tables where they filled plates with slices of pie and cookies and small sandwiches. They found seats near the back where Zara could observe without feeling too exposed, and for a while they just ate and watched the dancers forming up for a reel. People noticed them, of course. Zara could feel the speculative glances, hear the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. Mrs. Henderson came over to say hello, her eyes bright with curiosity and approval. Several of the ranch hands from the Iverson place where Boone worked stopped by to chat, friendly and respectful in a way that made Zara think Boone must be well liked among them. And through it all, Boone stayed close but not oppressive, a steady presence that made the evening bearable and then, gradually, almost enjoyable. The music was lively, the fiddle player skilled enough to make even the simple folk tunes sound bright and joyful. Zara found her foot tapping unconsciously, and when Boone noticed, he smiled. "Feel like trying a dance?" he asked. "Fair warning, I really am terrible at it." "No," Zara said, but the refusal was less sharp than it would have been a month ago. "I'm fine watching. Suit yourself. Though I'm going to look mighty foolish dancing alone." He was teasing, she realized, gently teasing her in a way that held no malice or pressure, just warm humor. And something about that, about the way he could joke without making her feel mocked, made her dare to push back a little. "You said you wouldn't make me dance," she pointed out. "I said I wouldn't pressure you," Boone corrected. "Asking once isn't pressure. Asking 17 times would be, so I'll stop at 1 and respect your answer. See? I'm already respecting it." "You're ridiculous," Zara said, but there was no heat in it. "That's what my sister always said. I come by it honestly." Boone took a sip of cider and settled back in his chair, watching the dancers with apparent contentment. "Thank you for coming tonight, Miss Bennett. I'm glad you're here." "Zara," she said suddenly. "You can call me Zara if you want to." Boone turned to look at her, surprise and pleasure clear on his face. "I'd like that. And you can call me Boone if that suits you." "Boone," Zara said, testing the name in her mouth. It felt strange and intimate to use his first name, but also right somehow. "All right." They stayed for another 2 hours, talking and watching and eating more pie than was probably wise. Boone told her stories that made her almost laugh, actually laugh, something she hadn't done in so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like. He introduced her to people with pride in his voice, as if bringing her to the social was an accomplishment he was pleased with. And slowly, gradually, Zara felt some of the ice inside her chest begin to thaw, just a little, just enough to let in a small amount of warmth. True to his word, Boone had her back to the store by 10 o'clock. They stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of her door, their breath fogging in the cold night air, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I had a nice time," Zara said finally, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "Thank you for inviting me." "I had a nice time too," Boone said softly. "Maybe we could do it again sometime. Not necessarily a social, but maybe dinner or a walk or just sitting and talking. Whatever you'd be comfortable with." Zara knew she should say no. Saying yes was dangerous, was opening herself up to the possibility of hurt and disappointment and all the things she'd sworn to avoid. But standing there in the starlight with Boone looking at her with such hope and kindness, she found she didn't want to say no. Didn't want to slam the door on this fragile, tentative connection that had somehow formed between them despite all her best efforts to remain isolated. "Maybe," she said, which wasn't yes but wasn't no either. "Ask me again sometime." "I will," Boone promised. "Good night, Zara." "Good night, Boone." She went inside and closed the door, then stood in the darkness of her store listening to his footsteps fade away down the street. Her heart was beating fast and her hands were trembling slightly, and she felt more alive than she had in years. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and she didn't know what to do with the tangle of emotions swirling through her chest. But that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Zara dreamed of something other than empty roads and endless running. She dreamed of warm brown eyes and patient smiles and hands that helped without demanding anything in return. Winter settled over Cripple Creek in earnest as November turned to December, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold that kept most people close to their fires. But Boone continued his visits to the store, now coming 2 or 3 times a week, even when he didn't need supplies, just to check that Zara had enough firewood and that the roof wasn't leaking and that she wasn't running low on food. At first, Zara protested these visits, insisting she could take care of herself, but Boone would just say something like, "I know you can, but humor me." And somehow she'd find herself accepting his help, letting him carry wood or fix some small thing that had broken. He asked her to dinner twice, and both times she said no, but the second time she added, "Maybe after Christmas," and saw the way his face lit up with hope. They talked more on each visit, conversations that ranged from trivial to profound. Boone told her about his plans to save enough money to buy his own land, maybe up in the high country where there was good grazing and water. Zara told him about her mother's dream of owning a bookshop, how she'd loved reading above all things and had passed that love to Zara. They argued amiably about whether Kansas or Missouri had better soil for farming, discussed the relative merits of different breeds of horses, debated whether coffee or tea was superior for warming up on cold mornings. And through all these ordinary conversations, Zara felt her walls crumbling bit by bit, worn away by Boone's steady, patient kindness. He never demanded more than she could give, never pushed her to trust him faster than she was ready to. But he was always there, reliable as sunrise, offering friendship without conditions or expectations. The week before Christmas, a bad storm rolled through and dumped nearly 2 feet of snow on the town overnight. Zara woke to find the door of her store completely blocked, snow piled so high she couldn't open it from the inside. She was trying to figure out how to dig herself out through the back entrance when she heard the sound of a shovel scraping against wood, and 10 minutes later Boone had cleared a path to her door. "Morning," he said cheerfully when she opened up, stamping snow from his boots. "Thought you might need some help digging out." "How did you know?" Zara asked, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold air rushing in. "I didn't for certain, but I knew the snow would be deep and I figured you might be blocked in, so I came to check." He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, riding several miles through a snowstorm just to make sure she was all right. "You didn't have to do that," Zara said, but her voice was soft, almost wondering. "I know. I wanted to." Boone met her eyes steadily. "Zara, I know you're used to taking care of yourself and I know you're good at it, but that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone all the time. Friends help each other. That's what friends do." "Is that what we are?" Zara asked. "Friends? I hope so," Boone said quietly. "I'd like to think we are, but if you don't feel that way yet, that's okay too. I'm patient." "I've noticed," Zara said, and this time she did smile, a small, genuine smile that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. Boone's answering smile was radiant. "There it is. I was starting to think you'd forgotten how." "Forgotten what?" "How to smile. You should do it more often. It suits you." Zara felt herself blushing and turned away under the pretense of banking the fire. "Do you want coffee, since you rode all this way?" "I'd love some," Boone said, and came inside, closing the door against the cold. They sat together in the relative warmth of the store, drinking coffee and watching through the window as the town slowly dug itself out from the storm. Boone talked about Christmases past, about his mother's tradition of making spice cookies, and his father's practice of reading the nativity story aloud on Christmas Eve. Zara found herself sharing memories of her own childhood Christmases, back when her mother was still alive and they'd lived in Ohio near her mother's family, before her father had uprooted them after her mother's death. "You ever miss Ohio?" Boone asked. "Sometimes," Zara admitted. "I had aunts and uncles there, cousins. But after Mama died, Papa couldn't stand staying in places that reminded him of her. So we left and we kept leaving, and eventually I stopped thinking of anywhere as home." "What about here?" Boone asked gently. "Could Cripple Creek be home?" Zara considered the question seriously. "Maybe," she said finally. "I'm not sure I remember how to let a place be home. Home means staying, means putting down roots, means being vulnerable to loss. It's easier to keep moving." "Easier," Boone agreed. "But not better, not really. Running away doesn't make the hurt stop. It just means you're alone with it." "Is that why you stopped running?" Zara asked. "Is that why you're here in Cripple Creek instead of still drifting from ranch to ranch?" Boone was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Partly," he said at last. "But mostly I stopped because I realized I was getting older and I had nothing to show for all those years of running. No home, no friends, no connections to anyone or anything. And I looked ahead and saw myself at 50 or 60, still alone, still running, and I knew that wasn't the life I wanted. So I stopped. Picked Cripple Creek more or less at random, found work at the Iverson Ranch, and decided to stay long enough to actually put down roots. See if I could build something real instead of just existing day to day." "And have you?" Zara asked. "Built something real." "I'm trying," Boone said, and the look he gave her was so warm and open and full of meaning that Zara felt her breath catch. "I've made friends at the ranch. I'm saving money for that land I want to buy. And I've met someone who makes me think that maybe, just maybe, I could have more than I ever let myself hope for." Zara knew he was talking about her, and the knowledge filled her with terror and longing in equal measure. "Boone, you don't have to say anything," Boone interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I just want you to know that I care about you, Zara. Not because I want something from you, but because you're worth caring about. And whatever happens, whether you ever feel the same way or not, I'm glad I met you. You've made my life better just by being in it." Zara's eyes were burning with unshed tears, her throat too tight to speak. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, not with such unvarnished honesty and no expectation of reciprocation. Matthew had said pretty words, but they'd been manipulation disguised as affection. Her father had loved her in his way, but he'd been too lost in his own grief to really see her. And everyone else in her life had been temporary, passing through without leaving a mark. But Boone's words settled into her chest like seeds in warm earth, and she could feel something beginning to grow there, something fragile and new and terrifying. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to let someone care about me. I don't know how to trust that you won't hurt me or leave me or turn out to be someone different than who you seem to be." "I know," Boone said softly. He didn't move from his chair, didn't try to touch her or crowd her space. And I can't promise I'll never hurt you, because people hurt each other sometimes even with the best intentions. But I can promise that I'll never hurt you on purpose. I can promise that I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to go. And I can promise that who you see is who I am. No hidden agendas, no ulterior motives. Just a man who thinks you're remarkable and would like the chance to prove himself worthy of your trust if you'll give it to him. What if I can't? Zara asked, her voice breaking. What if I'm too broken, too damaged by everything that's happened? What if I've forgotten how to let anyone in? Then we'll figure it out together, Boone said. One day at a time, one small step at a time for as long as it takes. There's no rush, Zara. I'm not going anywhere. And somehow, impossibly, Zara believed him. Looking into his eyes, seeing the steady certainty there, the infinite patience and genuine caring, she believed that he meant what he said. That he would wait for her, would meet her where she was instead of demanding she be someone she wasn't ready to be. Okay, she said finally, the word barely audible. Okay, let's try. I don't know what that means or where it goes, but I'm willing to try. The smile that spread across Boone's face was like dawn breaking, brilliant and warm and full of joy. That's all I'm asking for, a chance. We'll figure out the rest as we go. They finished their coffee in a silence that felt comfortable, almost companionable. And when Boone finally left to ride back to the ranch, Zara stood in the doorway watching him go with a feeling in her chest that she was afraid to name, but that felt remarkably like hope. Christmas came and went quietly. Boone brought Zara a gift on Christmas Eve, a small leather-bound journal with blank pages that he said were for writing down whatever she wanted, thoughts or dreams or just daily observations. My mother kept journals, he explained. She said writing things down helped her understand her own mind better. I thought maybe you'd like to try it. Zara gave him a knitted scarf she'd made in secret over the past 2 weeks, working on it late at night when she couldn't sleep. It was simple, dark gray wool, but the stitches were even and the length was generous. For riding in the cold, she said, suddenly shy about the gift. So you don't freeze on those long trips between the ranch and town. Boone wrapped the scarf around his neck immediately, his eyes bright with pleasure. It's perfect. Thank you, Zara. I'll treasure it. They spent Christmas evening together in the store, Zara cooking a simple dinner of chicken and vegetables while Boone regaled her with increasingly ridiculous stories about Christmases past, until she was actually laughing, real genuine laughter that made her stomach hurt and her eyes water. It was the best Christmas she'd had in years, maybe ever, and when Boone left that night, he kissed her forehead gently, so gently she barely felt it, and said, "Merry Christmas, Zara. Thank you for letting me spend it with you." Zara touched her forehead after he'd gone, her fingers tracing where his lips had briefly pressed, and felt warmth spread through her entire body. The new year of 1882 arrived with more snow and a cold snap that froze the creek solid. January was hard, business slow as people stayed home to avoid the weather, and Zara found herself looking forward to Boone's visits with an anticipation that both pleased and frightened her. He came 3 or 4 times a week now, always with some excuse, needing supplies or checking on repairs he'd made or just stopping by to warm up before the ride back to the ranch. But Zara knew, and she thought Boone knew she knew, that the excuses were just that. He came because he wanted to see her, and she looked forward to his visits because she wanted to see him too. They took walks together on days when the weather allowed, Boone pointing out animal tracks in the snow and teaching her to identify different bird calls. He taught her to shoot more accurately, taking her out to a secluded spot past the edge of town where they could practice without drawing attention. Zara had thought she knew how to handle a gun, but Boone showed her better techniques, how to steady her breathing and squeeze the trigger instead of pulling, how to anticipate the recoil and adjust her stance. He was a patient teacher, encouraging without being condescending, and by the end of their third practice session, Zara could hit a target at 50 paces more often than not. "You're a natural," Boone said approvingly after she'd put 5 shots in a row into the center of the makeshift target they'd set up. "Where'd you learn to shoot?" "My father taught me the basics when I was 14, Zara said, reloading the revolver with practiced ease. He said a woman traveling alone needed to know how to protect herself. But he was never very good at teaching, too impatient. He'd show me once and expect me to get it right immediately, then get frustrated when I didn't. Sounds like my father in mathematics, Boone said. He was brilliant with numbers, could calculate anything in his head faster than most men could with paper and pencil. But he couldn't understand why I found it difficult, and he'd get so frustrated trying to teach me that I'd freeze up and make even more mistakes. My mother was better at teaching. She understood that people learn at different speeds and in different ways. "She sounds like a good woman," Zara said. "She was. You'd have liked her, I think. She was kind but not soft, you know. She had standards and she expected people to meet them, but she also understood that everyone stumbles sometimes. She'd have liked you too. She appreciated strength in people, and you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Zara looked at him in surprise. "I'm not strong. I ran away from everything, built walls, hid myself in a tiny store in a town where nobody knows me. That's not strength, that's cowardice." "No," Boone said firmly. "It's survival. And survival takes strength, Zara. You've been through things that would have broken a lot of people, but you're still here, still standing, still trying. That's not cowardice. That's courage of the most fundamental kind." Zara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away angrily. "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Saying things that make me feel like maybe I'm not as hopeless as I think I am. It's unsettling." Boone laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made something in Zara's chest feel light and buoyant. "I'll try to be less encouraging in the future," he said solemnly, but his eyes were dancing with humor. "You're impossible," Zara said, but she was smiling despite herself. "So I've been told. Come on, let's head back before we both freeze solid." They walked back to town side by side, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed, and Zara found herself moving a little closer each time it happened, drawn to Boone's warmth, both literal and metaphorical. February brought a thaw and then more snow, the weather unpredictable and challenging. On Valentine's Day, Boone showed up at the store with a bouquet of wildflowers that he must have ridden miles to find, since nothing was blooming anywhere near Cripple Creek. "I know it's a bit silly," he said, looking almost embarrassed as he held them out to her. "But I saw them growing near a hot spring about 10 miles north of here, and they reminded me of you. Hardy and beautiful despite the harsh conditions." Zara took the flowers with hands that shook slightly. They were simple alpine flowers, white and purple, but they were lovely, and the fact that Boone had ridden 10 miles in winter weather just to pick them for her made her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she managed to say. "They're beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," Boone said, and then immediately looked flustered. "Sorry, that was forward. I just meant it's okay," Zara interrupted. "Thank you for the flowers and the compliment." She put the flowers in a jar of water on the counter where she could see them while she worked, and they lasted almost 2 weeks, a bright spot of color in the dreary late winter days. And every time she looked at them, she thought about Boone riding through the cold to find something beautiful to give her, and felt the ice around her heart crack a little more. One evening in late February, Boone invited her to have dinner at the boarding house where he'd taken a room for the winter, since the ride to and from the ranch was becoming difficult with the unpredictable weather. Zara surprised herself by saying yes and found herself in Mrs. Henderson's dining room sharing a meal with Boone and 3 other boarders, a miner named Jack, a young schoolteacher named Miss Peters, and an elderly gentleman named Mr. Crane who claimed to have fought in the Mexican War and had stories to prove it. The evening was lively and warm, filled with conversation and laughter, and Zara found herself actually enjoying the company of these strangers who seemed to accept her without question or judgment. Boone was relaxed and happy, trading jokes with Jack and listening respectfully to Mr. Crane's long-winded stories. And Zara saw how easily he fit into this small community, how genuinely liked he was. It made her wonder if she could ever fit in that way, could ever be part of something larger than just herself. After dinner, Boone walked her back to the store through streets silvered with moonlight, their breath fogging in the cold air. They walked slowly, neither of them eager for the evening to end. "Thank you for coming tonight," Boone said as they reached her door. "It meant a lot to me having you there, seeing you smile and laugh and just be part of things." "I had a good time," Zara admitted. "Better than I expected." "Your friends are nice people. They could be your friends too if you wanted them to be. People like you, Zara, they just need a chance to get to know you." "I'm not very good at letting people get to know me." "No," Boone agreed, "but you're getting better. You let me in, didn't you?" "At least partway." "More than partway," Zara said quietly. "More than I've let anyone in since, in a very long time." Boone reached out slowly, telegraphing his intention clearly so she could pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. His fingers were warm despite the cold, calloused but gentle, and Zara felt a thrill run through her at the simple touch. "I'm honored," Boone said softly, "and I promise I won't take that trust for granted. I know how hard it was for you to give it, and I'll do everything I can to prove myself worthy of it." Zara looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curled around hers with such care, and felt something inside her shift and settle into place, like a puzzle piece finally finding where it belonged. "Boone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm falling in love with you, and I'm terrified." She felt him go still, his hand tightening slightly around hers. "Terrified why?" he asked gently. "Because love means vulnerability. Love means giving someone the power to hurt you. And I've been hurt before, badly enough that I swore I'd never give anyone that power again. But somehow you've gotten past all my defenses without me even realizing it, and now I'm here and I'm falling and I don't know how to stop it, or if I even want to stop it, and that scares me more than anything." Boone used his free hand to tip her chin up gently, making her meet his eyes. His expression was so tender, so full of love and understanding that Zara felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I'm falling in love with you too," Boone said, his voice rough with emotion. "Have been for months, probably since the first time you looked at me with those eyes like winter, and I saw the hurt hiding behind all that ice. And I'm not going to lie and say loving someone isn't scary, because it is. It's the scariest thing in the world, giving someone your heart and trusting they won't break it. But Zara, I swear to you, I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that your trust isn't misplaced. I will be patient when you need patience, strong when you need strength, and always, always kind, because you deserve kindness. You deserve love, and I want to be the one who gives you both if you'll let me." "What if I can't be what you need?" Zara asked through her tears. "What if I'm too damaged, too cold, too broken to be a good partner?" "You're not broken," Boone said firmly. "You're wounded, and there's a difference. Wounds can heal. And you're not cold, not really. You're just protected, but I've seen the warmth inside you, Zara. I've seen your strength and your courage and your capacity for caring, even when you try to hide it. You're everything I need, exactly as you are." "I don't know how to do this," Zara whispered. "I don't know how to be in love, how to be with someone, how to trust that it won't all fall apart." "Neither do I, not really," Boone admitted. "I was married for 3 years, but Sarah and I were so young when we wed, barely 18, and we were still learning each other when she died. So I'm figuring this out too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out together, make our own way without worrying about how it's supposed to be. What do you think?" Zara looked into his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had been so consistent in their kindness, so steady in their patience, and felt the last of her walls crumble into dust. "I think I'd like to try," she said. "I think I'd like to see where this goes, with you." Boone's smile was radiant even in the dim light from the street lamps. "That's all I'm asking for," he said. "A chance. We'll take it slow at whatever pace you're comfortable with. No pressure, no expectations beyond honesty and kindness. Does that work for you?" "Yes," Zara said, and then, before she could lose her courage, she stretched up on her toes and kissed him, quick and soft and tentative. Boone went very still for a heartbeat. Then his free hand came up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness, and he kissed her back, slow and sweet and full of promise. It was nothing like the aggressive, demanding kisses Matthew had forced on her. This was a conversation, a question and answer, a giving and receiving that made Zara feel cherished rather than claimed. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing fast, their faces flushed with cold and emotion. Boone rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his hand still cradling her cheek. "That was perfect," he said softly. "You're perfect." "I'm not," Zara said, but there was no heat in it, just wonder at this thing that was happening between them. "Perfect for me then," Boone amended. "Will you let me court you properly, Zara Bennett? Let me take you to dinner and dances and on walks. Let me spend time with you and learn everything there is to know about you. Let me prove that I'm serious about this, about us." "Yes," Zara said, the word coming easier this time. "Yes, I'll let you court me." "Best answer I've ever received to any question I've ever asked," Boone said with a grin. He kissed her once more, briefly, then stepped back reluctantly. "I should let you go inside before we both freeze, but I'll come by tomorrow if that's all right." "It's all right," Zara said. "More than all right." She went inside and closed the door, then leaned against it with her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating wild and fast. She was falling in love. She was letting someone in. She was taking a risk that terrified her. But for the first time in years, the terror was mixed with joy, with hope, with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this time things would be different. That night she wrote in the journal Boone had given her, the first entry she'd made despite having owned it for over a month. She wrote about being afraid and being brave, about walls and thawing, about a cowboy with patient hands and kind eyes, who'd somehow melted through defenses she'd thought were impenetrable. And when she finally slept, she dreamed of brown eyes and warm smiles and a future that didn't look quite so lonely anymore. March arrived with the first real hints of spring, the snow beginning to melt, and the days growing longer and warmer. Boone courted Zara with old-fashioned persistence, taking her to dinner twice a week, bringing her small gifts of wildflowers or interesting stones he found on his rides, teaching her to play chess on a board he'd carved himself from pine wood. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing their histories and their hopes, their fears and their dreams. Zara told him about Matthew finally, one evening in late March when they were walking along the creek bank watching the water rush past, swollen with snowmelt. She told him about the courtship that had seemed romantic at first, about how Matthew had swept her off her feet with pretty words and grand gestures. She told him about how quickly the romance had soured, how Matthew had become possessive and demanding, how he'd expected her to agree to marry him after barely 2 weeks. And she told him about the night Matthew had cornered her in the boarding house where she'd been staying, had tried to force himself on her despite her protests, had said terrible things about women who led men on and deserved whatever they got. "I fought him," Zara said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I scratched his face and kneed him hard enough that he let me go, and I ran. Grabbed my things and left that very night, didn't even wait until morning. I was so scared he'd come after me, or that no one would believe me if I reported what he'd done, or that they'd say it was my fault for leading him on. So I just ran, and I kept running for 2 years, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections, never letting anyone get close enough to hurt me again." Boone had stopped walking, his face pale and his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You didn't deserve that. No one deserves that. And you were right to run, right to protect yourself. But I need you to know that I'm not him. I could never force myself on you or anyone. The idea makes me sick." "I know," Zara said, wiping her eyes. "If I thought you were like him, I wouldn't be here with you. But that's why I've been so guarded, why it's taken me so long to trust you. It's not about you, not really. It's about what he did to me, to my ability to trust and feel safe with men." "I understand," Boone said gently. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "And I'm grateful you told me. I know that wasn't easy. But Zara, you need to know that there's no rush with us, no timeline we have to follow. If you're never ready for more than this, more than walking and talking and holding hands, that's okay. I'll take whatever you can give and be happy with it, because being with you in any capacity is better than not being with you at all." "I want more," Zara said, surprising herself with the admission. "Not now, not yet, but eventually. I want to be able to be with you fully without fear or hesitation. I want to be able to give myself to you the way you've given yourself to me. I just need time." "You have all the time you need," Boone promised. "I'm not going anywhere." They continued walking hand in hand, and Zara felt lighter for having shared her secret, for having trusted Boone with the darkest part of her past. And when he kissed her goodbye that evening, it was with the same gentleness and patience he'd always shown. No demands or expectations, just warmth and care and the promise of as much time as she needed. April brought real spring to Cripple Creek, the hills turning green and wildflowers blooming in bright carpets of color. Boone had moved back out to the ranch for the summer work season, but he still came to town at least twice a week, and on Sundays when the store was closed, Zara would ride out to meet him, and they'd spend the day together exploring the countryside or simply sitting by the creek talking. It was on one of these Sundays, a warm afternoon in late April with the sky brilliant blue overhead, that Boone asked Zara to marry him. They were sitting on a blanket near the creek, having finished a picnic lunch Zara had packed, and Boone was lying on his back staring up at the clouds drifting past. Zara was beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, feeling peaceful and content in a way she'd never thought she'd feel again. "Zara," Boone said suddenly, sitting up and turning to face her with an expression of nervous determination. "I know we've only been courting for a few months. And I know you need time, and I'm not trying to rush you. But I want you to know that I'm in this for the long term. I'm not courting you for fun or to pass the time. I'm courting you because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And I guess what I'm saying is, when you're ready, when you feel like you can trust me enough and want to take that step, I'd be honored if you'd marry me." Zara's heart was pounding in her chest, fear and joy tangled together in a knot she couldn't quite separate. "Boone, you don't have to answer now," Boone said quickly. In fact, I'd rather you didn't answer now. I want you to think about it, really think about it, and only say yes if you're sure. Because marriage is forever, or it should be, and I need you to be certain. But I wanted you to know where I stand, what my intentions are. I want to marry you, Zara Bennett. Not tomorrow, not next week, but someday when you're ready. And I'll wait as long as it takes. Zara reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. I love you, she said, the words coming easier than they had the first time she'd said them a month ago. And I can see a future with you, see us building a life together. But you're right that I need time. I need to be sure I can be the wife you deserve, that I can give you what you need without my past getting in the way. Your past is part of who you are, Boone said. I'm not asking you to forget it or pretend it didn't happen. I'm just asking you to let me be part of your future, to let me help you build new memories that are better than the old ones. We'll take our time. There's no rush. Thank you, Zara said softly. Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for understanding. Always, Boone promised, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her believe it. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, talking about what their life might look like if they did get married. Boone told her about his dream of buying land and building a small ranch, maybe running cattle and horses, living somewhere with open sky and room to breathe. Zara told him about her idea of expanding the store, maybe adding a lending library since books were hard to come by in Cripple Creek. They talked about children, agreeing that they'd like to have some someday if they were blessed that way, but also agreeing that being together would be enough even if children didn't come. They talked about growing old together, about building something that would last, about being the kind of couple who still held hands and laughed together even after 50 years. And with each word, each shared dream, Zara felt more certain that this was real, that Boone was real, that the future they were imagining together was possible. May and June passed in a blur of work and courtship and growing certainty. Zara found herself more open with everyone, not just Boone, as if learning to trust him had reminded her how to trust in general. She made friends with Mrs. Chen from the bakery, with Miss Peters the school teacher, even with Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. She attended church socials and town meetings and even helped organize a 4th of July celebration. And through it all, Boone was there, proud and supportive, never demanding attention but always present when she needed him. It was on the 4th of July, watching fireworks explode over Cripple Creek in showers of colored sparks, that Zara realized she was ready. Ready to say yes, ready to commit to a future with Boone, ready to take the risk of marriage and all it entailed. The fear was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. What she felt most strongly when she thought about marrying Boone was joy, anticipation, hope. She told him that night after the celebrations had ended and they were walking back to her store through streets still crowded with happy people. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said, her hand tight in his. Boone's steps faltered slightly. And my answer is yes. I want to marry you, Boone Irwin. I want to build a life with you. I'm ready. Boone stopped walking entirely and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers in the dim light from the street lamps. Are you sure? Truly sure? Because I meant what I said about waiting as long as you needed. I'm sure, Zara said, and realized as she said it that it was true. She was sure as she'd ever been about anything. I love you and I trust you, and I want to be your wife. Boone let out a whoop of joy that made several passing people look over in surprise. Then he picked Zara up and spun her around, laughing with pure happiness. When he set her down, he was grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. You've just made me the happiest man in Colorado, maybe the whole country. I love you so much, Zara. I promise I'll spend every day of our marriage making sure you never regret this decision." "I know you will," Zara said, and kissed him there in the middle of the street, not caring who saw or what anyone thought. They were married 3 weeks later on a warm Saturday afternoon in late July, in the same church where they'd attended their first social together 9 months earlier. It was a simple ceremony with just a handful of guests, the friends Zara had made in Cripple Creek and the ranch hands Boone worked with, but it was perfect. Zara wore a new dress of cream-colored linen that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair that Boone had picked that morning. Boone wore his best suit and the gray scarf Zara had knitted him for Christmas, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Boone kissed her, Zara felt like she was finally, truly home. They honeymooned for a week at a small cabin Boone had borrowed from the ranch foreman, a secluded place up in the high country with a view of the mountains that seemed to go on forever. It was there, in that peaceful place far from town and prying eyes, that Zara finally let go of the last of her fear and gave herself to her husband completely. Boone was patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to Zara's eyes. This was what it was supposed to be like, she realized. This was what love felt like when it was real and mutual and built on trust. Not taking but giving, not demanding but asking, not forcing but honoring. Afterward, lying in Boone's arms with the sound of the wind in the pines outside and the warmth of his body pressed against hers, Zara felt completely at peace for the first time in her adult life. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Boone asked, his hand stroking her hair in a soothing rhythm. "For being patient, for being kind, for melting through all my walls and showing me that love doesn't have to hurt." "You don't need to thank me for that," Boone said softly. "Loving you isn't a hardship or a sacrifice, it's a joy. You're a joy, and I'm the one who should be thanking you for giving me a chance, for trusting me enough to let me into your heart." "We're both pretty lucky, I think," Zara said. "The luckiest," Boone agreed and kissed the top of her head. They returned to Cripple Creek a week later to start their married life together. They moved into a small house Boone had rented on the edge of town, a 2-room place with a front porch and a yard big enough for a vegetable garden. Zara kept running the store, which was doing well enough that she could hire a part-time helper to cover when she needed to be away. Boone continued working at the ranch but started saving more aggressively toward buying his own land. And every evening they'd sit together and talk about their plans, their dreams, their future. The first year of their marriage was an adjustment, learning to live together and navigate the small conflicts that arose from two independent people becoming a unit. But they worked through disagreements with honesty and kindness, never going to bed angry, always willing to listen to each other's perspective. And with each challenge overcome, each compromise reached, their bond grew stronger. Zara learned that marriage to Boone was nothing like the nightmare scenarios she'd imagined based on her experience with Matthew. Boone never tried to control her or diminish her independence. He supported her business and encouraged her friendships, and never made her feel like she was less than him because she was a woman. And gradually, month by month, Zara relaxed into the marriage, let down the last remaining guards, trusted completely that Boone was who he said he was and would continue to be that person. In the spring of 1883, Boone found the perfect piece of land 10 miles south of Cripple Creek, 160 acres with good water and grazing, a small creek running through it and stands of aspen along the hills. It was more than they'd thought they could afford, but the owner was an elderly rancher looking to retire and move back east to live with his daughter, and he was willing to sell to Boone at a fair price with payments over time. They bought the land in April and spent every spare moment over the next months building a house, a small, sturdy structure of logs and stones that Boone constructed with help from the ranch hands and men from town. Zara helped where she could, and on days when she couldn't be there, she prepared meals and sewed curtains and planned how they'd furnish their new home. It was hard work, exhausting and challenging, but it was also deeply satisfying, building something that was truly theirs. They moved into the new house in October, leaving behind the rented place in town. Zara sold the store to a young couple newly arrived from Kansas, using the money to buy cattle and horses for the ranch. It was bittersweet leaving the store that had been her refuge and her fortress for so long, but she was ready for the next chapter, ready to build something new with Boone. Their first winter on the ranch was harsh, but they weathered it together, snug in their small house with a good stove and plenty of firewood. Boone worked hard managing the cattle and horses, and Zara discovered she enjoyed ranch life more than she'd expected, like the physical labor and the connection to the land and the animals. She started breeding chickens and learned to make butter and cheese, and together, she and Boone created a life that was simple but deeply fulfilling. In the spring of 1884, Zara realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with joy and terror in equal measure, all her old fears rising up about vulnerability and loss. But Boone was there, steady and calm, holding her hand through the fear and talking with her about their hopes for their child. They prepared together, fixing up the small second bedroom in the house and buying supplies from town. And when Zara went into labor on a cold night in November, Boone stayed with her through every moment, holding her hand and encouraging her and looking at her with such love that it gave her strength to keep going. Their son was born just before dawn, a healthy baby with a strong cry and a shock of dark hair like his father. They named him William, after Boone's father, and called him Will for short. Holding her son for the first time, feeling his tiny weight in her arms and seeing Boone's face lit with wonder as he looked at his child, Zara felt a wholeness she'd never known was possible. This was her family. These were her people. This was home. The years that followed were full and rich, not without challenges but faced together with love and determination. Will grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses and following his father around the ranch. In 1886, Zara gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Boone's first wife, a gesture Zara offered because she understood that honoring the past didn't diminish the present. Sarah was a quieter child than her brother, thoughtful and observant, with her mother's steel-gray eyes and her father's warm smile. The ranch prospered under Boone's careful management, growing from a small operation to a respected spread that provided well for the family. Zara started a small lending library in their home, accumulating books whenever they went to town, and lending them out to neighbors who gradually became friends. She and Boone hosted occasional gatherings, dinners and dances and celebrations, and Zara discovered she actually enjoyed being social when it was on her own terms, in her own home, surrounded by people she'd chosen to let into her life. In 1889, when Will was 5 and Sarah was 3, Boone and Zara took the children to visit Ohio, to see the place where Zara had grown up and meet what remained of her mother's family. It was a bittersweet journey, seeing the old places and remembering the girl she'd been, but it was also healing, reconnecting with cousins and aunts who welcomed her back without judgment or questions about where she'd been. They stayed for 3 weeks, and when they returned to Colorado, Zara felt like she'd finally made peace with her past. finally closed that circle. The children grew and thrived, Will developing his father's skill with horses and Sarah showing a talent for numbers and books that suggested she might become a teacher someday. Boone and Zara grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year, becoming less the passionate intensity of new love and more the steady, enduring warmth of true partnership. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodbye and hello, still made time to sit together in the evenings and talk about their day. In 1891, when Will was 7 and Sarah was 5, Zara gave birth to another son, a surprise baby they named Thomas. By then Zara was 34, Boone was 36, and they'd thought their family was complete. But Thomas arrived anyway, a happy accident who brought fresh joy and energy to their household. He was a sweet-natured child, easygoing in a way his older siblings weren't, and he completed their family in a way none of them had known was missing. The years passed in the way years do, full of the ordinary rhythms of ranch life and family. There were good years and hard years, years of plenty and years of drought, times of joy and times of sorrow. They lost Boone's sister to influenza in 1893, lost a third of their cattle herd to a hard winter in 1895. But they weathered each storm together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good ones. In 1896, when they'd been married 14 years, Boone and Zara took a rare trip alone together, leaving the children with a trusted neighbor for a week while they traveled to Denver for a cattlemen's convention. It was the first time they'd been alone together for more than a night since Will was born, and it felt like a second honeymoon, staying in a fancy hotel and eating in restaurants and simply enjoying each other's company without the demands of children and ranch work. One evening they were walking through Denver's streets, looking in shop windows and talking about nothing in particular, when Boone stopped suddenly and pulled Zara into an embrace right there on the sidewalk. "What was that for?" Zara asked, laughing and slightly embarrassed by the public display. "Just needed to hold you for a minute," Boone said, his arms tight around her, "and tell you that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. These 14 years with you have been the happiest of my life, and I thank God every day that I walked into that store in Cripple Creek and met a woman with ice in her eyes and walls around her heart. Best day of my life, meeting you." "Second best day of my life, meeting you," Zara said, her own arms wrapped around him just as tightly. "What was the best?" "The day I said yes to your proposal. The day I decided to trust you and take a risk on love. That was the day my life really started, even though I didn't fully realize it at the time." "I love you, Zara Irwin," Boone said, using her married name with the same pride he always did. "I have loved you from nearly the first moment I saw you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond if there's anything beyond." "I love you too," Zara said, and kissed him there in the middle of Denver with people walking past and the evening light fading to dusk. "Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for melting through all those walls. Thank you for showing me that love could be safe and good and the foundation for everything else. Thank you for letting me," Boone said. "Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering cowboy who didn't have much to offer except a sincere heart and a willingness to wait as long as it took." They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, and Zara thought about the journey they'd taken together. From that first day when she'd held a gun with steady hands and looked at him with cold eyes, to this moment, 14 years later, when she stood in his arms feeling completely safe and completely loved. It had been a long road with plenty of obstacles and detours, but they'd traveled it together, and that had made all the difference. They returned to the ranch and their children refreshed and reconnected, ready to face whatever the future held. The years continued to pass, Will growing into a young man who helped run the ranch with increasing skill. Sarah starting to teach the younger children at the small school that had been built in the area. Thomas growing from a sweet baby into a mischievous boy who kept everyone on their toes. In 1900, as the century turned and the Old West slowly gave way to the new, Boone and Zara stood on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. They were both in their early 40s now, weathered by sun and work but still strong, still healthy, still deeply in love. Their 3 children were in the yard, Will teaching Thomas to rope a fence post while Sarah sat on the steps reading a book. The ranch was thriving, their home was full of laughter and love, and Zara felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. Did you ever imagine this? She asked Boone, leaning against him as his arm came around her shoulders. Did you ever think we'd build all this when you first walked into my store back in 1881? I hoped, Boone said. I hoped from pretty much the first moment I saw you that maybe, somehow, you'd give me a chance. But did I imagine all this? Our home, our children, our life together? No, I don't think I dared imagine something this good. I just knew I wanted to try, wanted to see if I could convince you that taking a risk on me would be worth it. It was worth it, Zara said softly. It was worth every moment of fear and doubt. You were worth it. So were you, Boone said. Every moment of patience, every careful step, every time I had to prove myself again because your walls were so high and so strong. All of it was worth it to be here now. With you, with our children, with this life we've built. They stood together watching the sunset fade to twilight, watching their children play in the yard, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. And Zara thought about walls and ice, about fear and trust, about a cowboy who'd seen through her defenses to the hurt underneath, and had decided that she was worth the effort of melting through all that frozen protection. He'd done it with patience and kindness, never demanding, never forcing, just consistently showing up and being present and offering love without conditions or expectations. And slowly, so slowly she'd barely noticed it happening, he'd thawed her frozen heart and taught her to trust again, to love again, to hope again. I'm glad you didn't give up on me, Zara said, even when I made it so hard. I never even considered giving up, Boone said. You were worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth everything. And I knew, somewhere deep down, that underneath all that ice was a woman capable of great love if she could just find someone safe enough to give it to. I wanted to be that someone. I needed to be that someone. You are, Zara assured him. You're my someone, Boone. You're my safe place, my home, my love. Everything good in my life now traces back to you, to your patience and kindness and refusal to let my walls keep you out. And everything good in my life traces back to you, Boone said. To your strength and courage and willingness to take a risk on love one more time even after you'd been hurt. You could have stayed frozen, stayed safe behind your walls forever. But you chose to thaw, chose to let me in, chose to build this life with me. That took more courage than I think you realize. The children were being called inside for supper by the ranch hand's wife who helped with cooking, and Boone and Zara followed them into their warm, bright home filled with the smells of food and the sounds of family. And as they sat down together around the table they'd built with their own hands, in the house they'd constructed with their own labor, surrounded by the children they'd created together, Zara offered up a silent prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for Boone and his patient kindness. Gratitude for the courage to let her walls down. Gratitude for this full, rich life they'd built together. The years that followed saw their children grow into adults and start families of their own. Will married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread and built a house on the far side of their property, expanding the family ranch. Sarah married a schoolteacher from Cripple Creek and moved to town, where she opened her own small school and taught 2 generations of children to read and cipher. Thomas, true to his easygoing nature, became a veterinarian and traveled between ranches caring for sick animals, though he always came home for Sunday dinners and holidays. Boone and Zara became grandparents, and then great-grandparents as the years rolled on. They grew old together on the ranch they'd built, their hair going gray and then white, their hands becoming gnarled with age and work, but their love never diminishing. They still held hands every evening when they sat on the porch watching the sunset. They still kissed each other goodnight. They still told each other, "I love you," every single day, never taking those words or the feelings behind them for granted. In 1921, when they'd been married for 44 years and were both in their mid-60s, Boone had a heart attack while mending fence on the north pasture. He survived, but it was a warning that their time was growing shorter, that the years they had left together were precious and numbered. They talked honestly about death and what came after, about their wishes for their final days and for their legacy. And they decided to write down their story, the story of how they'd met and courted and built a life together, so their children and grandchildren would always know how love could transform even the most frozen heart if it was patient and kind enough. Zara did most of the writing, since Boone's hands weren't as steady anymore, and she poured into those pages everything she remembered and felt about their long journey together. She wrote about being afraid and alone, about building walls to protect a heart that had been damaged too many times. She wrote about a cowboy who'd walked into her store and seen past her coldness to the hurt underneath, who'd decided she was worth the effort of patience and kindness and persistent, gentle care. She wrote about thawing slowly, about learning to trust again, about discovering that love didn't have to hurt if you found the right person to give your heart to. And she wrote about the life they'd built together, about the ranch and the children and the decades of partnership and devotion. She wrote about growing old together, about facing challenges side by side, about the deep, abiding love that came from choosing each other every single day for more than 4 decades. She wrote it all down, and when she finished, she read it to Boone on the porch one summer evening while the sun set behind the mountains and their great-grandchildren played in the yard. Boone cried as he listened, unashamed tears running down his weathered cheeks. "That's beautiful," he said when she finished. "That's our story, everything that matters about us. Promise me you'll make sure the family gets this, that they'll know how much we loved each other and how hard we fought to build something good." "I promise," Zara said, taking his hand in hers. "They'll know. Everyone will know that true love exists, and patience and kindness can overcome even the highest walls." Boone lived another 5 years, years that were slower and quieter but no less full of love. He died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1926, Zara beside him holding his hand, their children and several grandchildren gathered around. His last words were, "I love you," said to Zara with a smile on his face, and she held him as he slipped away feeling grateful that he'd gone peacefully, without pain, surrounded by love. Zara lived another 12 years after Boone died, staying on the ranch with Will and his family taking care of her. She spent her final years surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the family that she and Boone had created together. And she never stopped telling stories about her cowboy, the man who'd melted through her frozen fortress of a heart with nothing but patient kindness and pure, enduring love. She told the children about how they'd met, about how scared she'd been, about how Boone had never given up on her even when she'd made it so hard. And she told them that real love was like that, patient and kind and willing to wait as long as it took, because the person you loved was always worth the wait. Zara died in her sleep on a winter night in 1938, at the age of 81, and they buried her next to Boone on a hill overlooking the ranch with a view of the mountains they'd both loved. At her funeral, her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to celebrate her life and remember the love story she'd shared with Boone. A story of walls and thawing, of fear and courage, of patience rewarded, and kindness returned 1,000-fold. And on her headstone, beneath her name and dates, they carved the words that summed up everything she and Boone had been to each other. Her heart was guarded like a frozen fortress. He melted every wall with patient kindness pure. Together they built a love that lasted forever. The ranch still stands today, now in its 5th generation of family ownership, and the story of Boone and Zara is still told around dinner tables and on front porches, a reminder that love can heal even the deepest wounds if it's patient enough and kind enough and true enough. Their story is a testament to the power of gentle persistence, to the triumph of compassion over fear, to the truth that frozen hearts can thaw and walls can fall and happiness can be found even after the darkest times. It's a story of the Wild West and the people who settled it, of hardship and triumph, of loss and redemption. But most of all, it's a story of love, the kind of love that transforms lives and builds legacies and lasts long after the people who lived it have passed into memory and legend. And that love, that patient, kind, enduring love, continues to echo through the generations. A gift Boone and Zara gave to everyone who came after them. Proof that the best things in life are worth waiting for and worth fighting for and worth building slowly, carefully, with all the patience and kindness and pure devotion that two hearts can muster.